The wind whistled through the cracks of the little shack at the edge of the village, carrying with it the sharp bite of early winter. Inside, a small boy of only 5 years sat curled on the dirt floor, hugging his knees against his chest. His clothes were tattered, barely holding together, and his ribs pressed against his skin in a way no child should. His name was Samuel, though most in the village simply called him the poor boy, or that orphan. Life had been unkind to him from the very beginning. His mother had died when he was still a baby, and his father, a wandering laborer, had disappeared one day, never to return. Since then, Samuel had been forced to survive on what little scraps he could find. Sometimes an old woman would toss him a piece of stale bread. Other times he would sneak behind the tavern and dig through discarded bones. Hunger was his constant companion, and yet he never cried in front of others. If he had learned anything in his short, hard life, it was that tears only made people look away faster. Despite his suffering, Samuel carried a quiet strength. Every morning he woke before dawn to fetch water from the creek. The bucket was nearly as big as he was, but he dragged it anyway, his bare feet raw against the frozen ground. He would drink a little, wash his face, and then sit on the hill, overlooking the village. From there he would watch the sun rise, his only comfort, the one thing no one could take from him. The villagers knew of him, of course, but they chose to ignore him. To them, Samuel was a reminder of things they didn't want to face: poverty, weakness, abandonment. Some even whispered that he was cursed, for how else could such misfortune follow a child? When he walked through the narrow lanes of the settlement, people would draw their children closer, as though his misfortune were contagious. He grew used to the glares, the averted eyes, and the whispers. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that revealed his heart. Once, he found a bird with a broken wing near the creek. While most children would have left it to die, Samuel gently wrapped the bird in a scrap of cloth and kept it close to him for weeks, feeding it crumbs until it was strong enough to fly again. He smiled that day, watching it vanish into the clouds, though no one was there to see. Another time, a toddler from the village dropped her toy doll near the edge of the road. Samuel picked it up and tried to return it, but the girl's mother snatched her away, glaring at him as though he meant harm. He stood there holding the doll for a long time, then quietly set it on the doorstep before slipping away. Each night, Samuel lay on his pile of straw and listened to the distant laughter. A family sharing meals by the fire. He wondered what it might feel like to be wanted, to be loved, to have someone waiting for him at the end of the day. He had no answer, only an aching emptiness in his chest. And yet, despite it all, there was a spark inside him. He never grew bitter. When others mocked or ignored him, he didn't curse them. Instead, he dreamed. He dreamed of being strong one day, strong enough to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He dreamed of being seen not as the poor boy, but as someone who mattered. It was on one such cold morning, as Samuel sat on the hill watching the sun rise, that he first heard the distant rumble. At first he thought it was thunder rolling across the horizon. But then the sound grew louder, closer, until it became clear that it was not thunder at all. It was footsteps. Heavy, steady footsteps that made the ground tremble beneath him. Samuel's heart raced. He turned his gaze toward the trees at the edge of the valley. 2 figures emerged from the mist, tall, broad-shouldered, their silhouettes unmistakably human but larger, stronger, fiercer than any man he had ever seen. Their steps carried the weight of warriors, and though their faces were still shadowed, he felt their presence pierce the morning air. The villagers had not yet seen them. Samuel sat frozen, clutching his thin arms against his chest. He was only a boy, small and weak, and yet he knew something was about to happen. Something that would change not only his life, but the life of everyone in the village. And it would begin with him. The morning mist had barely lifted when the village awoke. To the sound of unease, the villagers went about their chores, but their movements were restless, hurried, their eyes darting toward the forest that bordered the settlement. Something in the air felt heavy, unsettled, as though the earth itself held its breath. Samuel, perched on his usual hill, watched it all unfold with quiet curiosity. He noticed things most people ignored, the way the blacksmith hammered harder than usual, as if drowning out his own worry, the way mothers pulled their children closer, whispering with pale faces, the way the hunters returned from the woods, too quickly, carrying half-empty sacks, glancing over their shoulders as if they'd been chased away. By midday, the rumors began. A pair of old men sat outside the tavern, muttering to each other in hushed tones. Samuel crouched nearby, pretending to dig in the dirt, but his ears sharpened at their every word. "They say the tribes are restless again," one said, spitting, into the dust. "Drums were heard 2 nights ago, deep in the forest. It could mean war." The other shook his head grimly. "War, famine, sickness. It doesn't matter which. Trouble's brewing and it's heading this way. Mark my words. War." The word was heavy in Samuel's ears. He had no real grasp of battles or politics, only the fragments he had overheard in whispers. He knew it meant fear, blood, and loss. He shivered, pulling his thin shirt tighter around himself. As the afternoon sun stretched shadows across the ground, the tension in the village grew thicker. People spoke of hunters sighting figures in the distance, tall, strong silhouettes moving through the trees, watching, waiting. Some swore they had seen painted faces, warriors scouting the land. Others dismissed it as paranoia, but whether truth or rumor, fear seeped into every corner of the settlement. Samuel wandered through the village unnoticed, his stomach growling. He paused at the bakery, inhaling the warm scent of bread, but the baker's wife shooed him away with a sharp look. Hunger gnawed at him, but something else pressed heavier against his heart, the unease that clung to the air. That evening, the elders called a gathering in the square. Torches flickered against the dusk as the people crowded together, their voices low, anxious. Samuel slipped between legs and barrels until he found a spot near the edge, sitting on the ground, small enough to remain unseen. The oldest man in the village, Elder Corbin, stood with his crooked staff, his face drawn and weathered. His voice cracked as he spoke. "My friends, you have all heard the rumors. Our scouts have indeed seen movement near the forest. Warriors, 2 of them at least, heading this way." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her child. "Tighter!" And a man muttered a curse under his breath. "But," the elder continued, raising a hand for silence, "we must not act out of fear. The tribes have passed this way before, and not all come for war. Perhaps they are hunters or traders." The crowd was unconvinced. A burly farmer shouted, "Or perhaps they come to take our food, our land, our lives." Murmurs of agreement spread quickly, voices rising, anger and fear feeding off one another. Samuel hugged his knees, watching silently. He could feel the weight of their fear, see it in their eyes. And yet, something tugged at him, something deeper than fear. For though the villagers spoke of danger, he sensed a different kind of story was unfolding. As the meeting broke apart, the villagers returned to their homes, locking doors and shuttering windows. Mothers tucked children into bed early, and fathers checked their rifles, setting them close at hand. The settlement was wrapped in silence long before nightfall, every house dim, every lantern snuffed, as if the darkness itself was safer than being seen. Samuel, however, had no door to lock, no family to protect him. He returned to his shack and lay on his straw bed, staring at the cracked roof above. The words from earlier echoed in his mind. War, warriors, danger. His small chest rose and fell quickly with unease. But then, Something strange stirred inside. Him, a spark of curiosity, stronger than fear. If warriors were truly coming, why? What would they look like? Would they be as terrifying as the villagers said, or would they be something else entirely? The boy didn't know it yet. But his questions would be answered sooner than he imagined. For beyond the tree line, where the mist still clung to the earth, two towering figures were indeed moving closer, their steps heavy, deliberate. And by dawn, the whispers of danger would no longer be whispers. The morning broke gray and cold, the kind of dawn that carried silence heavy enough to unsettle even the strongest men. A fog hung low over the valley, wrapping the village in a pale shroud. Chickens clucked nervously in their pens, dogs barked, and then went quiet. And the people of the settlement lingered behind their doors, peeking through cracks as if waiting for something unseen. Samuel sat on his hill, barefoot as always, his thin arms wrapped around his legs. He had not slept much the night before. The villagers' whispers of danger had settled into his chest like a stone, making his stomach churn with a fear he did not fully understand. And yet that same spark of curiosity burned inside him, refusing to let him hide. He wanted to see what others feared. He wanted to know. The fog shifted. The trees beyond the meadow seemed to stir, as though something vast moved among them. Samuel squinted into the mist. For a long moment there was nothing, only shadows and the sound of his own heartbeat. Then he saw them. Two figures emerged from the forest, their shapes towering, their steps deliberate and slow. They were enormous compared to the farmers and townsfolk Samuel had always known. Broad shoulders draped with furs, strong arms lined with scars that told the story of many battles. Feathers, beads, and markings decorated their hair and faces, signs of their people's strength and traditions. Their presence seemed to bend the air around them as though they carried the weight of storms in their stride. They were warriors, and they did not try to hide it. Samuel's small body trembled, but he did not run. His eyes widened with awe more than terror. These were the figures the villagers had whispered about, the warriors, the danger. Yet, standing there on the hill, the boy felt no malice in them, only weariness and purpose, as though their journey had already cost them dearly. Down in the village, the reaction was immediate. A sharp cry rang out. Someone had spotted the approaching men. Doors slammed shut, shutters clattered closed, and voices rose in panic. Within moments, the square that usually buzzed with morning life fell silent, emptied of people. From behind walls and curtains, eyes watched in fear as the warriors advanced. The two men reached the edge of the settlement and stopped. Their presence filled the open space, tall and unyielding, yet they made no move to draw weapons. Instead, they stood still, their breaths forming white clouds in the cold air. The silence was broken by a shout from one of the braver villagers, a man gripping a rusty rifle from behind a fence. "Go back!" he yelled, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound strong. "We don't want trouble here!" The warriors did not flinch. They exchanged a glance, then continued walking, not toward the armed man, not toward the square, but toward the hill where Samuel sat. Samuel froze. His heart pounded so loudly he thought they could hear it. Why were they coming to him? He was just a poor boy, smaller than their shadows. Surely they sought the elders or the strong men with weapons, not him. And yet their eyes were fixed on him as if they had known he would be there, waiting. The villagers whispered frantically from their hiding places. "Why the boy?" someone muttered. "What do they want with him?" But no one stepped forward to stop them. Fear chained them where they stood. The warriors approached slowly, their heavy steps pressing into the damp earth. Samuel wanted to run. Every part of his small body screamed at him to flee, but his legs refused to move. Instead, he watched as they drew closer until their shadows fell over him, covering him like a blanket of night. One of the men knelt. It was a strange sight, this giant lowering himself before a frail child. His dark eyes, fierce and piercing, softened with something Samuel did not recognize: respect. In a voice deep and heavy with exhaustion, the warrior spoke words that carried across the silent village. "Little one, help us." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the air, unbelievable and impossible. Behind him, the villagers gasped in shock. Two mighty warriors, men who could have crushed any of them, were not demanding, not threatening, but begging a child. The second warrior bowed his head low, his voice breaking with urgency. "Our people suffer. We need you." Samuel's small hands clenched into fists against his knees. He could barely comprehend what was happening. Two fierce warriors had come all this way, not for the elders, not for the soldiers, but for him, a poor boy no one cared about. And in that moment, though he did not yet understand why, Samuel felt the weight of destiny pressing onto his tiny shoulders. The square was silent, save for the low crackle of a torch left burning by the well. The villagers watched from their shuttered homes, peering through cracks in the wood, holding their children close. Fear thickened the air like smoke. Two fierce warriors had come, not with weapons raised, but with heads bowed, and their plea had been directed not to the men with guns, nor to the gray-haired elder, but to a boy so thin he looked as though the wind might carry him away. Samuel sat frozen at first, knees pulled tight to his chest. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. He could not make sense of it. Why him? He was nobody. The villagers had never asked anything of him, not even a kind word, let alone trust. And now, before the eyes of all, two men of immense strength and stature had knelt to him, their voices heavy with desperation. The taller warrior looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. "Child," he said softly, "you are not afraid. That is why we ask you." Samuel blinked. Not afraid. His small hands trembled against his legs, his stomach twisted in fear, but somehow, deep inside, he knew the man was right. He had lived with hunger and loneliness so long that fear had become a part of him, a constant shadow. And when fear never left, it lost some of its power. Behind him, a sharp voice rang out from the safety of a shutter. It was the baker's wife, her words sharp as daggers. "Leave the boy alone. He cannot help you." Another voice joined, an old man growling, "If you want aid, beg it from the elders, not a child." The warriors did not turn their heads. They kept their eyes on Samuel, as though the voices of the villagers did not matter. It was Samuel who mattered. The boy's gaze darted toward the houses. He could see the shapes of faces pressed against the slats of windows, the glow of lanterns, within. Every villager who had ever ignored him, turned him away, or cast him out was watching now. Their eyes weren't filled with contempt this time, but with fear and something else. Curiosity. Samuel felt it like a weight pressing on him. He could choose to shrink back, to retreat into the shadows where he had always been kept. Or he could stand, and in doing so, break the pattern of his entire short life. His chest rose and fell quickly. His bare feet shifted against the dirt. Then, slowly, with a determination that surprised even himself, Samuel stood. A murmur rippled through the village. The boy who was always invisible now stood tall in the open square, dwarfed by the towering men before him. His knees shook, but his chin lifted ever so slightly, and that small gesture carried more strength than any weapon. The shorter of the two warriors bowed his head lower still, his deep voice resonating with something almost reverent. "The spirits guided us here. They told us a heart pure enough to help would be found in this place. We see now it is you." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to ask what they needed, to understand why fate had placed this moment upon him. But his voice caught, and all that came out was a whisper. I don't know how. The taller warrior's hand, scarred and strong, pressed to his chest in a solemn gesture. You have courage, little one. That is the first gift of a healer, of a leader. With courage, all else can be learned. From behind a shutter, someone hissed, "This is madness! He's just a child!" But the words only made Samuel's resolve solidify. He had heard that his whole life, that he was too small, too weak, too unworthy, and yet here, now, two men who could have crushed the village beneath their strength were kneeling to him as though he were already something more. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt seen. Not pitied, not despised. Seen. He drew a breath, straightened his narrow shoulders, and looked from one warrior to the other. His voice, though small, carried clearly across the square. What do you need from me?" The villagers gasped. A child was speaking to warriors as though he had the right. The warriors exchanged a look, relief washing over their faces. The shorter one answered, his tone solemn and heavy with urgency. "Our people are dying. Sickness spreads through the camp. We were told the villagers here keep herbs, medicine, but they turned us away before." His eyes flickered toward the shuttered homes. "So we came to the one who does not hide." Samuel's chest tightened. They had asked him because no one else would listen. The villagers who had shunned him were too paralyzed by fear to act, but these men, giants in their strength, had placed their trust in a starving child. The boy glanced once more at the darkened houses. He could feel every eye watching, waiting, for him to fail, perhaps even hoping he would. But Samuel had already made his choice. He took a step forward, then another. Standing between the warriors and the fearful village, he lifted his chin and whispered words that would mark the beginning of everything. "I'll help you." The square, silent moments before, now filled with stunned gasps. A boy stood alone. Not just in body, but in spirit. Against fear, against doubt, against everything he had ever been told about himself, Samuel had chosen courage, and from that moment nothing would ever be the same. The air in the square was taut, like the string of a bow pulled too tight. Samuel's words still lingered. "I'll help you." For a heartbeat, it was as if time itself had frozen. The boy stood small and fragile between the towering warriors, and the hidden eyes of the village, and in that fragile body lay a strength no one had expected. The taller warrior lowered himself further, both knees pressing into the earth as he bowed his head before the child. His deep voice rolled like distant thunder, carrying across the empty square. "Then hear us, little one. Our people are suffering. We are warriors, yes, but our strength means nothing against this sickness. It spreads like fire through dry grass. The old fall first, then the children. Even our strongest men grow weak." The second warrior spoke next, his voice trembling with urgency. "We have tried everything we know. Roots, herbs, prayers. Nothing stops it. The healers say it comes from the river, poisoned by something we cannot see. Our mothers cry through the night. Children grow thin. Their breath rattles as they sleep. We came here because we were told, your village has medicines we do not." The words pierced the stillness. Behind their shutters, the villagers shifted, their faces pale. Samuel turned, glancing toward the homes. He saw shapes pressed against the wood, eyes peering through cracks. He knew the truth. The village did indeed have medicines, bundles of dried herbs, tinctures and remedies kept by the healer who once lived there. But that healer had died 2 winters ago, and since then, the supplies had been hoarded and guarded, doled out sparingly, only to their own people. Samuel had often seen the herbs when he sneaked near the healer's shed, smelling their strange, bitter scent. He knew where they were kept. He knew because while no one had given him food or kindness, no one had thought to stop him from wandering where he pleased. The villagers, however, whispered harshly among themselves. One man hissed, "They lie. They only want to weaken us, to steal from us." Another muttered, "Let them suffer. Better them than us." Samuel's small fists clenched at his sides. He had grown used to cruelty directed at himself, but this was different. These were warriors on their knees, their voices breaking as they begged, not for themselves, but for their children, their mothers, their tribe. The taller warrior lifted his head, his gaze heavy with sorrow. "We would never bow to enemies, but we bow to you, child, because we see in you a spirit untouched by fear and hatred. You are not like them." His eyes flickered toward the shuttered homes, then back to Samuel. "Help us, and you will save more lives than you can imagine." Samuel's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell them he would, but he felt the weight of the entire village pressing down on him. From behind one of the doors, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "He is just a boy. He cannot help you." Another voice rose, harsher, still. "If you take our herbs, there will be nothing left when sickness comes here. Do not risk us for strangers." The warriors stiffened, but did not rise. Instead, the shorter one looked directly at Samuel. His eyes, dark and steady, seemed to pierce straight into the boy's soul. "We do not ask them," he said. "We ask you. Will you walk with us? Will you show us the way?" Samuel's breath hitched. Walk with them? Into the forest? Into the unknown? Fear coiled in his stomach, sharp and cold. He had never left the village's edge, never dared to step beyond the safety of the fields. And yet, what safety had he truly ever known? Hunger, loneliness, and rejection had been his, constant companions. Now, for the first time, he was needed. His eyes lifted to the fog that still clung to the trees. He thought of the children the warriors spoke of, their thin breaths rattling in their sleep. He remembered the bird he once healed with crumbs and scraps, the joy he felt watching it fly again. Was this so different? Behind him, the villagers muttered curses. "Foolish boy," one spat. "He'll bring death to us all." But Samuel no longer listened. Their voices, which had once defined his life, no longer mattered. He turned back to the warriors, his voice quiet but steady. "I know where the herbs are. I can get them." The taller warrior's eyes widened with something close to relief. The shorter one's lips parted in something Samuel almost mistook for a smile, though it carried the weight of grief. "You are braver than men twice your size," he said. "The spirits were right to send us here." Samuel's knees shook, but he stood firm. For the first time in his short life, he wasn't just the poor, forgotten boy at the edge of the village. He was someone with the power to change everything. And though fear still burned in his belly, another fire had begun to grow, a fire of purpose. The village square buzzed with a low, uneasy murmur. Samuel's words, "I know where the herbs are. I can get them," had fallen like a spark onto dry kindling. Fear and anger rippled through the crowd hidden behind shutters and doors. For a moment, no one moved. Then the voices began, sharp and accusing. "He'll bring them into our homes," a woman cried, pulling her child away from the crack in the window. "The boy's cursed," muttered an old man, his voice hoarse. "Letting him meddle will doom us all." Another shouted, "If he takes what we have, what happens when the sickness comes here? What then?" The words spilled into the air, thick with panic. Though the villagers trembled, their fear twisted quickly into hostility. Samuel felt it like a cold wind on his back, every word pushing him further away from the only place he had ever known. The warriors stood silent, letting the storm of voices rage. Their dark eyes flicked to the doors and shutters, but remained fixed on Samuel, their calm in stark contrast to the chaos around them. Samuel's hands clenched at his sides. He had expected fear, perhaps even hesitation. But not this, not outright refusal to help those who were suffering. He swallowed hard, his small throat tight with both anger and sadness. He turned, raising his voice as best he could. "But they're dying! Children, like me, don't you understand?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the creak of a shutter swinging open. Elder Corbin, bent and gray, leaned on his staff as he stepped forward. His weathered face was grim, his voice low but carrying across the square. "Samuel, you are just a boy. You do not understand the weight of what you offer. Our stores are not endless. If sickness comes to us, we will need them. To give them away to outsiders may mean our own undoing." Samuel's eyes stung. He respected Elder Corbin. The old man had never been cruel to him, though never kind either. But now the words cut deep. "But if we do nothing, they'll die," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "Isn't a life worth saving, even if it's not from here?" The elder shook his head slowly. "It is not so simple, child. You think with your heart, but survival requires hard choices." From behind him, voices rose in agreement. "He's right. We can't risk it." "Better them than us." Samuel's chest burned with fury. For years he had endured their scorn in silence, but now something inside him broke. He stepped forward, his thin body trembling, his voice rising higher than it ever had before. "You've all ignored me, left me hungry, left me cold. And now you do the same to them? They're people, just like us. Their children laugh. Their mothers cry. Their fathers fight to protect them. Do they deserve to die because they weren't born here?" His words echoed in the square. For a brief moment, there was silence. Some villagers looked down, ashamed. Others scowled, anger, flashing in their eyes, but none answered. None stepped forward. The taller warrior finally spoke, his voice steady. "We did not come to beg from cowards. We came to find one brave enough to stand when others hide." His gaze swept over the shuttered homes, then rested again on Samuel. "We have found him," the shorter warrior added, his voice low. "If the boy helps us, his courage will be remembered. But if you hold your herbs until death comes knocking at your own doors, your cowardice will be remembered too." The villagers bristled, their fear twisting into defensive anger. "Threats won't sway us," one man shouted. "Take your troubles elsewhere." The warriors said no more. Their silence was heavier than any threat could have been. Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing against his small shoulders. He glanced toward the healer's shed, just beyond the square. The door was likely still barred, but he knew how to slip inside. He always had. He could do it. He could take what was needed, but doing so meant turning his back on the village once and for all. They would not forgive him. He would no longer simply be invisible. He would be an outcast, branded a traitor. His thin chest rose and fell. He thought of the bird he once nursed back to flight. He thought of the faces of unseen children gasping for breath in a distant camp. And then he thought of his own life, of nights cold and lonely, of doors slammed in his face, of hunger that gnawed him until he cried silently in the dark. What had the village ever truly given him? Samuel lifted his chin, eyes glistening but determined. "Then I'll do it alone." The villagers gasped, some in anger, some in disbelief. Elder Corbin's shoulders sagged, but he did not stop the boy. Perhaps he knew it was useless. Samuel turned from the crowd, his small figure standing taller than it ever had before. The warriors straightened, their presence looming like mountains at his back, silent but steady. For the first time, Samuel did not feel small. He felt chosen. And as he walked toward the healer's shed, The villager's refusal faded behind him like an old wound. The village seemed to hold its breath as Samuel walked across the square. His bare feet pressed against the cold earth, every step heavier than the last. Behind him, the warriors stood silently, their immense figures like shadows of protection. Ahead, the healer's shed waited, small, weathered, its door barred with a heavy plank. The boy's heart pounded. He knew the shed well. As a child too often ignored, he had wandered its edges many times, peeking through its cracks, listening to the creak of the wood when the wind pressed against it. Inside, bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, their sharp scents lingering. Even through the walls, he had once pressed his nose against a gap in the boards and sneezed, startling himself into laughter, though no one had been there to share the sound. Now the shed was no longer a curiosity. It was the line between life and death. Behind him, a voice rose from a shuttered window. "Don't do it, boy! You'll curse us all!" Another shouted, "Leave it be! Those herbs belong to us!" Samuel stopped, his small body trembling. For a moment, doubt clawed at him. He was only 5 years old, thin as a reed, weak from hunger. What right did he have to make such a choice? Then he felt it, the eyes of the warriors upon him, not demanding, not forcing, but steady. They had bowed to him, a child. They had trusted him when no one else ever had. That trust burned in his chest like fire, driving out the cold hand of doubt. He clenched his fists. If not me, then who? Reaching the shed, Samuel pressed his hand against the door. The wood was rough beneath his palm, splinters biting into his skin. He glanced around. No villager stepped forward to stop him, though many cursed and hissed from behind their walls. His small fingers curled around the bar. It was heavy, far heavier than he expected. He strained, pulling with all his might. His arms shook, his teeth clenched, but slowly, inch by inch, the bar lifted. The door groaned as it swung open, releasing a breath of air thick with the scents of dried herbs and roots. Samuel coughed but pushed his way inside. The shed was dim, dust floating like golden flecks in the thin light that filtered through the cracks. Herbs of every kind hung from beams above, their colors faded, but their power still strong. Jars lined the shelves, powders, tinctures, mysterious liquids that shimmered faintly in the gloom. Samuel's eyes widened. He didn't know which. Ones would help, but he remembered listening to the healer years ago before the old man passed away. Certain leaves brewed into tea soothed fevers. Bitter roots crushed into paste eased pain. Dried flowers steeped in water helped children breathe easier. He recalled the names the healer muttered, strange and hard to pronounce, but Samuel had remembered their shapes, their smells. He had nothing else in his life, so he remembered. His small hands reached up, trembling but steady. He gathered the bundles he recognized. The thin green leaves with sharp edges, the yellow-tipped roots, the white-petaled flowers. He placed them carefully into an old sack he found hanging from a nail. Each item he took felt heavier, not in weight, but in responsibility. Behind him, the voices of the villagers rose louder, angrier. "Stop him! He's stealing from us! He'll bring ruin!" But no one entered the shed. Fear kept them frozen. Samuel bit his lip, pushing aside the fear their voices tried to plant in him. He filled the sack until he could carry no more. Then he slung it over his thin shoulder, nearly staggering under its weight. His knees bent, but he did not fall. When he stepped out into the square again, the sight silenced even the loudest of his critics. A frail boy, smaller than the sack he carried, stood in the center of the village holding what they all feared to give. His dark eyes gleamed with a courage far too large for his tiny frame. The shorter warrior stepped forward, his face etched with something between reverence and sorrow. He bowed low to the boy. "You have done more than most men would dare," he said. The taller warrior placed a massive hand gently on Samuel's shoulder, careful not to crush him. "You carry hope now, little one," the villagers muttered, some ashamed, others furious. But Samuel no longer listened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't defined by their scorn. He had chosen his own path. As he stood between the warriors, sack of healing herbs in his arms, Samuel realized something remarkable. Though he was still hungry, still poor, still small, he was no longer powerless. He was brave. And with that bravery, he was about to step beyond the boundaries of the only world he had ever known. The sun had slipped below the horizon by the time Samuel stepped beyond the edge of the village. The last streaks of orange and crimson bled away, leaving the land cloaked in a heavy indigo gloom. Behind him, the whispers of the villagers still lingered, carried on the cold night air. Some cursed his name, others muttered in fear, but none had dared stop him. The boy walked forward with the sack of herbs slung over his shoulder, guided by the two silent warriors who strode at his sides. The wilderness opened before them like a living shadow. Gnarled trees clawed at the sky, their branches swaying in the rising wind. The tall grass rustled with unseen creatures, and every distant howl made Samuel's small frame stiffen. Yet he pressed forward. Each step took him further from the only place he had ever known and deeper into a world that felt both terrifying and sacred. The warriors did not speak often. When they did, their voices were low and steady, rumbling like distant thunder. One walked ahead, scanning the path with sharp eyes. The other walked just behind Samuel, making sure the boy's tiny legs did not falter. Their presence was both a comfort and a reminder. These men, so fierce and strong, had entrusted their people's hope to a child no taller than their waists. The path wound into the woods, where moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy. Samuel stumbled more than once, his bare feet scraping against roots and stones. His sack grew heavier with every mile, and soon his shoulders burned. Still, he refused to complain. Each time his knees wavered, the shorter warrior glanced back, his expression unreadable but his eyes warm, as if silently telling him, "Keep going. You are stronger than you know." As the night deepened, the air grew colder. Samuel shivered, clutching the sack to his chest for warmth. The taller warrior noticed and removed a strip of fur from his own cloak, wrapping it around the boy's shoulders. Samuel sank into its warmth, the rough but comforting texture reminding him of something he had nearly forgotten, what it felt like to be cared for. They walked for hours, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves and the boy's quiet breaths. At one point, a wolf's howl split the night, close and hungry. Samuel froze, his heart racing. From the corner of his eye, he saw the taller warrior grip the shaft of his spear, muscles tightening like coiled rope. The sound faded and they moved on, but Samuel clung tighter to the sack, realizing just how small he truly was in this vast wilderness. Yet fear wasn't the only thing stirring in his chest. There was also wonder. The night sky stretched above them, vast and endless, glittering with more stars than Samuel had ever seen. The villagers never looked up at the stars, but the warriors did. At a clearing, the shorter one pointed skyward, murmuring words in his own tongue, reverent and soft. Samuel didn't understand, but he sensed the meaning. The stars were not just lights, but guides, ancestors watching, promises of direction even in the darkest night. The boy tilted his head back, staring until his neck ached. For the first time, he felt the enormity of the world and his place in it. He was small, yes, but not meaningless. Near midnight, his legs finally wavered. He stumbled, nearly collapsing, the weight of the sack too much. Before he could hit the ground, the taller warrior caught him with one arm, lifting him as easily as if he were no heavier than a bundle of reeds. Samuel tried to protest, but exhaustion pulled at his eyelids. "You are brave," the warrior said in slow, careful words, his deep voice almost a lullaby. But even the brave must rest. They made camp beneath an ancient tree, its roots twisting like the arms of some ancient guardian. The warriors built a fire, and the crackling flames pushed back the darkness. Samuel huddled close, the warmth seeping into his tired limbs. He watched the warriors with sleepy eyes, the way they sharpened their weapons, the way they listened to the night as if it were speaking to them. Before long, sleep overtook him. He curled against the fur cloak, the sack of herbs still clutched, protectively in his arms. His dreams were filled with shadows, stars, and the echo of voices telling him he was stronger than he believed. When he woke at dawn, pale light spilled across the land. The warriors were already awake, standing tall, scanning the horizon. The world beyond the forest stretched before them, rolling plains and the faint smoke of campfires in the distance. The warriors' people were close. Samuel stood, rubbing his eyes, and tightened his grip on the sack. His body still ached, his feet still hurt, but inside him burned a new fire. He was no longer just a hungry, forgotten child from the edge of a village. He was a boy with a purpose, and with each step toward the warriors' suffering people, that purpose grew brighter. The rising sun painted the plains in soft gold as Samuel followed the two warriors toward the faint smoke that curled against the horizon. His legs still trembled from the night's journey, but the sight of their destination filled him with a strange mix of fear and resolve. Somewhere beyond that haze lay dozens, perhaps hundreds, of men, women, and children waiting, suffering, hoping for relief. When they crested a low ridge, the scene unfolded in full. Below stretched a vast encampment of hide tents and wooden frames, their colors dulled by time and hardship. But it was not the camp itself that struck Samuel. It was the silence. No laughter of children, no bustling of families. Instead, a heavy stillness hung over everything, broken only by coughing, groans, and the weak cries of the sick. The warriors exchanged glances, their fierce faces shadowed with sorrow. Then they descended, and Samuel followed. As they entered the camp, dozens of eyes turned toward them. Warriors too weak to rise lay against poles. Mothers cradled feverish infants. Elders sat wrapped in furs, their breaths shallow and labored. The boy's heart twisted. These weren't enemies, as his village whispered. They were people, suffering just as he had, only worse. The two warriors stopped at the largest tent and motioned Samuel inside. Within, the air was thick with smoke and sickness. Elders lay on mats, their lips parched, their skin pale. A woman bent over a child who could not stop shivering. The shorter warrior gestured toward Samuel with a voice that shook the air. "This boy, he has brought medicine." Murmurs rippled through the tent. Some looked doubtful, others desperate. A frail elder raised his head and peered at the tiny child with hollow eyes, as if trying to understand how so small a figure could carry such hope. Samuel swallowed hard, then opened his sack. He laid out the herbs, roots, and strips of bark on a mat. His hands shook, not from fear but from the weight of responsibility. He remembered how the village healer once brewed teas from these same plants to treat fevers. He had watched quietly from the shadows when no one noticed him. Those memories now stirred like lanterns in the dark. He asked for water. At first, they hesitated, unsure how much to trust him. Then a woman brought a clay bowl filled from a nearby stream. Samuel crushed the herbs carefully with a stone, mixing them into the water, his tiny fingers mimicking the motions he had once seen. He whispered softly to himself, repeating the healer's muttered words, half ritual, half memory. When the mixture was ready, he held it out to the woman with the shivering child. She hesitated, but the taller warrior nodded firmly. She tipped the bitter liquid into the child's lips. For a long moment, nothing happened. Samuel's heart raced. Then slowly, the child's shivering eased. His breathing deepened. The mother let out a choked sob of relief, clutching the boy close. The tent erupted in murmurs. More bowls were brought, and Samuel repeated the process. He worked tirelessly, guided by instinct and scraps of knowledge. Some drank and soon slept more peacefully than they had in days. Others showed small signs of strength returning, color creeping back into cheeks, fevered eyes growing clearer. Hours passed. The boy's arms grew sore, his eyes heavy, but he did not stop. The warriors stood guard at his side, handing him water, fetching herbs, guiding the sick toward him as though he were a healer in his own right. By midday, a faint energy returned to the camp. Children laughed softly for the first time in weeks. Mothers wept in gratitude. Old men clasped Samuel's tiny hands with trembling fingers, calling him little brother. The boy could barely believe it. These people, who had looked upon him with doubt, now looked upon him with reverence. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with the deep warmth of belonging, a feeling he had never known in the cold village where he was born. As the sun dipped low once more, the shorter warrior lifted Samuel onto his shoulder and carried him outside. The whole camp gathered. They had seen the change, felt the hope stirring in their hearts again. Hundreds of eyes fixed on the boy, their savior. The taller warrior raised his spear high. "This child," he thundered, "walked into the night for us. He carried courage in his small hands, and with it, he gave us life." A roar of approval swept through the camp, a sound that shook the very earth. Men and women raised their arms, children clapped, elders wept. And Samuel, perched on the warrior's shoulder, looked out across them all, his heart pounding. He was no longer the hungry, forgotten boy who scrounged scraps at the edge of a village. Here, among the warriors and their kin, he was something more. He was needed. He was cherished. And as night fell again, Samuel knew he had found a family, not by blood but by courage and compassion. The morning dawned clear, the kind of sky that seemed to promise new beginnings. Samuel stood at the edge of the native camp, the cool breeze brushing his hair as the warriors prepared to escort him back to his village. He clutched the now empty sack in his hands, its purpose fulfilled, yet it felt heavier than ever with the weight of all that had happened. Behind him, the camp was alive again. Children ran barefoot across the dirt, their laughter carrying in the air. Mothers hung hides to dry, their shoulders no longer bowed by despair. Elders sat upright, their eyes bright with strength returned. The herbs had not cured all, but they had given the tribe hope, and in that hope, life had returned. Samuel turned back to the two warriors who had first approached him. Their fierce expressions had softened in these last days. Where once they had looked at him with the sharp gaze of desperation, they now looked at him with something deeper. Respect. "You saved them," the shorter warrior said, his voice like a drumbeat. Samuel shook his head shyly. "I only remembered what I'd seen." But the taller warrior bent low so that his eyes met Samuel's. "Courage is not in strength, little one. It is in the heart that chooses to act, even when it trembles. And you acted when grown men would have turned away." The words sank deep into Samuel's chest. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his villagers, not even his family. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. The warriors placed their hands on his shoulders and guided him toward the path leading back to his village. And when they walked, the camp followed. Dozens of people, once weak and despairing, now moved behind Samuel as though he were a banner of hope. Warriors carried spears. Mothers held their children. Elders leaned on staffs, all of them walking. In silence, a living wall of gratitude at the boy's back. By the time the village came into sight, Samuel's stomach knotted. He remembered how those same villagers had scorned him, how they whispered about his poverty, how they shoved him aside. What would they say now, seeing him return with 2 fierce warriors and an entire tribe behind him? As they reached the outskirts, the villagers spilled out of their homes, their faces wide with shock. The poor boy they had dismissed so easily now walked at the center of a great host, guarded by men twice the size of any villager, honored by people they had always feared. Whispers spread like wildfire. "It's him, Samuel!" He left in the night. "We thought he'd never return." "Why are the warriors with him?" The boy stopped in the village square. The 2 warriors flanked him, tall as towers. The native tribe gathered behind, their numbers filling the open space. And Samuel, small and barefoot, stood before the crowd that had once treated him as nothing. The taller warrior raised his voice so all could hear. "This boy," he thundered, "crossed the night alone when we were dying. He carried medicine in his hands and courage in his heart. He gave our children hope. He gave our elders breath. He gave us life." The villagers gasped. Some bowed their heads. Others could only stare at the frail child they had once ignored. Samuel's cheeks burned, but he did not look down. For the first time, he did not feel smaller than those around him. He felt taller, as though the weight of their gazes only lifted him higher. The shorter warrior stepped forward, planting his spear into the ground. "From this day forward," he declared, "this boy is brother to our people. Wherever he walks, our spears will guard him. His name will be carried in our stories. And should harm ever come to him, it will be answered by us." The words struck the villagers like thunder. A murmur of awe swept through them. Samuel, once mocked as a destitute child, was now bound in honor to a tribe of warriors feared across the land. His village elder approached slowly, his wrinkled face pale. "Samuel, we misjudged you. Forgive us. You have done what none of us could." Samuel looked at him, then at the crowd. He saw the same faces that had once sneered at him, now softened with shame and respect. For a moment, bitterness pricked his heart. But then he thought of the camp, of the sick children smiling, again of the mother's tears of relief, and his bitterness melted away. "I don't need your forgiveness," Samuel said softly, his voice steady. "I only did what was right." Silence fell. The villagers bowed their heads, and the warriors, standing tall, placed their hands once more on Samuel's shoulders. That night, as the tribe prepared to leave, they invited Samuel to walk among them again. He chose to stay in the village, but the bond was sealed. He knew he would see them again, and when he did, he would not be a forgotten boy, but a brother, a healer, and a child of courage.